All right, hello. We are in chapter 10, talking about cognitive behavioral therapy. And I just want to preface that when we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of students really struggle with some of these concepts. The students that I find that do not struggle with them is if they've actually had cognitive therapy themselves. They've engaged in some type of therapy or treatment that was using cognitive behavioral therapy, and then it tends to make more sense. So if you're struggling to understand it, or if it feels like it's slipping through your fingers, it's not you. It just can be a challenge to understand how our thoughts can influence our feelings and our behaviors. And in fact, to be a cognitive behavioral therapist, it's actually training beyond grad school. There's additional training that you have to do once you get your master's degree, or it's recommended that you get additional training, and it can take 6 months to 2 years to feel competent doing cognitive behavioral therapy. So this is just an introduction. And in fact, this whole course is just an introduction into these theoretical approaches or mental models in terms of trying to understand the clients that we work with. And the goal here is that introduction, and then as you take other classes or you figure out what you're interested in, you can continue to do deeper dives into these different theories. So first, we'll just start at the basics. What does cognitive even mean? So in the in-person version of this class, I'll say, what does it mean when you hear the word cognitive? Like, what does it mean? And so cognitive can be used in psychology. It can mean many different things, but it mainly refers to mental processes like thinking. So think about cognitive as like thoughts. What are your thoughts? But it can involve lots of things. It can involve how you perceive information, how you conceive, how you remember, how you reason, how you judge, how you imagine, how you problem solve. But it's also beliefs. So beliefs aren't facts, right? They are our beliefs. And if we go back to Adler, he talks about how we can have problems with our beliefs, our private logic, our basic mistakes that we form when we're about 5 or 6 years old in terms of how we think the world works. And often we take those with us and we don't really examine those assumptions to see if they are true. And so that idea inspired a lot of the people who developed cognitive therapies. The cognitive behavioral therapies are the beliefs. And so that is a lot of what, when you can think about cognitive, it's just like, yeah, they are thoughts, but are they thoughts? Are they true, or are they what we believe to be true? And how are those thoughts causing us emotional distress? So, what do we know about cognitions, or what do we know about our thoughts? So, going back to Freud, approximately 40 to 60% of our thoughts are unconscious throughout the day. If we look at habit science, there's been studies that show that a lot of what we're doing are habits that we're not even thinking about them. So if I asked you what shoe do you put on first, your right or your left shoe? If I ask you when you put your jacket on, do you put your jacket through the right arm or the left arm? Most of us don't know because we're using shortcuts. We're using habits, basically. If you've ever driven in a car and have no idea how you got from your house to work because you've been zoned out, but somehow you got there safe and sound, that's when the some of those like background unconscious parts of our brain are working. So our cognitions, they can be conscious, they can be unconscious, but a large part of our thoughts are out of our awareness, that we're not even aware that we're thinking them. They can influence our emotions and behavior. So they can contribute to mental health disorders. They find that people who have depression often have thoughts and behaviors that will make the depression worse or make the anxiety worse. So they're looking at how can we change our thoughts to change how we feel and change our behaviors. Also know that our thoughts contain bias. So if we, just think in terms of confirmation bias, right? We favor information that confirms our beliefs or our attitudes, or unconscious bias, that we have biases that we're not even aware of, and they contradict actually our conscious thoughts or what we think about the world. Our thoughts aren't always rational. Sometimes we like to think of the feelings as being the irrational part, but sometimes our thoughts aren't rational. And Aaron Beck talked about observing that very successful people, by any standard that he worked with, would often believe that they were worthless, even though there was evidence to the contrary. Um, but the good news about cognitions is that they are flexible and can be changed. So that is also something that cognitive therapy works on, is just like, just because you have the thoughts that are making your depression worse or making your anxiety worse, they're so flexible that we can actually challenge those thoughts and then begin to replace those with more constructive thoughts as well. So what is cognitive therapy? It's a very simple idea. If you can change the way a person thinks, then you can reduce their symptoms. So if those symptoms are depression, if they're anxiety, or even stress. So if you can change the way a person thinks, you can reduce many of the symptoms that they're experiencing. It specifically focuses on changing negative or unhelpful thoughts that are known to aggravate depression or anxiety or lead to unhealthy behavior. So those are the thoughts that tend to be focused and targeted. So what are some examples of unhelpful thoughts? If we were in person, I would ask the class in terms of like, what are some helpful thoughts that you've had or that you've heard? And so some of the thoughts that come out are, I can't do anything right, or you might say to yourself, I'm such an idiot, or I should have known better. Those are some of those like thoughts that we have. So, how could those thoughts influence our emotions? So, let's do an exercise. What type of emotions could be connected to these thoughts? So, if you had the thought that there's no way I'll have enough time to get everything done by noon, what emotion might be connected to that thought? There's no way I'll have enough time to get everything done by noon, right? So you're going to feel a time pressure. When you feel pressure, you usually feel stressed or anxious. Another thought, it's unfair that I always have to remind Casey to do their dishes. So this could be a boundary crossing here, that you have to take responsibility for someone else. And so that you might kind of feel frustrated or anger, if you have that thought. Um, and then I feel so alone, no one really cares about me. So if you're feeling that no one cares about you, what kind of emotion could that drum up? And that could probably drum up a lot of sadness, or despair that you're feeling, right? So that is an example of how our thoughts can influence our emotions. And then there's a connection between how can our emotions influence our behavior? Because when we're dealing with cognitive behavioral therapy, we're talking about this idea they call the cognitive triangle. How do our thoughts influence our emotions and influence our behaviors? And then how do our behaviors reinforce our thoughts and reinforce our feelings? And then you can kind of get stuck in this like cycle. So how can emotions influence behavior? So example one, there's no way I'll have enough time to get everything done by noon. The emotion that you feel with that is anxious. And then what behavior could that cause you to do? There's no way if you feel that time pressure, like what behavior could happen for that? What might that make you do? So for some people, it might make them smoke a cigarette. For some people, it might make them procrastinate. For some people, that might make them, um, you know, uh, snack on unhealthy foods. For some people, that might make them just like scroll on their phones and ignore everything. So it just depends. Every person's different. Example two, thought. It's unfair that I always have to remind Casey to do the dishes. You feel angry. So what behavior could that do? So you might, snap at somebody. You might snap at Casey. You might start slamming things around the house. So those are some of the ways that that behavior could show up. Um, Example three, thought, I feel so alone. No one really cares about me, and you feel sad. And so what could that make you do? Well, that could make you just like um, um, continue isolate even more. So rather than like reaching out to like other people to see if that's true, you can decide to isolate, lie around in bed all day, just do things that behaviors that are going to help make it perpetuate those emotions and those thoughts that are there. So that's kind of like the gist of CBT. There's a connection between our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and that they can kind of get in this like unhealthy cycle, this unhealthy loop, and kind of create some of these moods or make some of our symptoms worse. Um, well, as I mentioned before, in terms of getting comfortable with CBT, you have to complete grad school, get a master's degree, and then there's additional training in CBT. So, like, there's the Beck Institute out in Philadelphia. You can get CEUs for a 6-week training course, and it usually takes therapists anywhere between 6 to 24 months to feel confident with using CBT. So, I just say that to say not to discourage you, but just so that you have an understanding of why this might feel challenging. It takes a while to understand some of these concepts. So, who are the founders of cognitive therapy? The two main founders are Albert Ellis. He started developing this idea in the 50s, and Aaron Beck in the 60s. And they both came to these ideas around the same time, and but separate from each other. So Aaron Beck was doing something very similar in his approach with therapy. He was trained in psychoanalysis. Albert Ellis was also trained in psychoanalysis, but they were found it to be limiting, and this was something that they realized was that could work. And so Ellis noticed that a lot of his patients had thinking errors, right? So that what Adler called basic mistake or private logic. Ellis said, I think he called it irrational beliefs, and Beck came to the same conclusion. Instead of calling it irrational beliefs, he called them cognitive distortions. So thinking being distorted. Um, so while it's the standard now, it was very controversial when they first started doing this work. And in fact, behavior therapists originally opposed cognitive therapy, although I believe they came around sooner than the psychoanalysts. But behavior therapists, remember, were just like, well, you can't observe thoughts, so why would we study that? So behavior therapists criticized it, and psychoanalysts definitely criticized it. It was so controversial that like people lost their jobs over it if they talked about cognitive. They had university medical boards and other key psychological organizations refusing to publish anything from non-Freudians, or they refused to publish any papers that had the word cognitive in it until the 1970s. So it was when it was being developed, it was not accepted by the two main players, which were behavior therapists and psychoanalysts. And now it has become the dominant therapy. And you'll find a lot of people having strong feelings about cognitive therapy now. So right now, people are reacting to cognitive therapy, but it hasn't been unseated. It is still the gold standard in many practices. So when we look at the development, we've got like the 1920s, 1930s to the 60s, where you have behavior therapy only focusing on behavior, and then we got in the 50s to the 70s where they're developing. Beck and Ellis are developing cognitive behavior, and they're focused on changing dysfunctional thoughts. The B part of CBT, the behavior, doesn't show up until the mid to late 1970s, where they're like, maybe we could also try to change behavior. And if we change behavior, maybe that could also change the thinking and the feeling. It was originally just geared towards changing the thoughts, and that would change the feelings and the behaviors. It wasn't focused on behavior. But there were some researchers that pushed pushed for that, saying, I think we can actually target behavior and that's going to change things as well. And so that came later. I say this to say that if you're ever looking through research, you're going to see like the rational emotive therapy or cognitive therapies, and they're not going to have they're not going to have the behavior in them. Because they don't adapt the behavior until much later down the road. So just that can just help you with if you're ever wondering why they're the name changes or why the name changes. So this is Albert Ellis. He was born in 1913. He passed away in 2007. He originally graduated with a bachelor's degree in business in 1934. He ended up getting working on his his PhD in clinical psychology at University of Columbia. And he didn't really like psychoanalysis. He thought it was passive. He thought it was ineffective. He didn't think it was very efficient. And so he was looking to develop something that was more efficient and effective working with his clients. So he began looking at some of the other theories that were out there. So he was very interested in Adler's idea of like private logic and basic mistake. There was also Karen Horney, and she had these ideas about the tyranny of shoulds. Um, we have Fromm, Sullivan, and I don't know how to say it, but Korzybski and Koo, who were doing optimistic auto-suggestion. And so he started looking at these other psychologists and looking at their theories and moving away from psychoanalysis. By 53, he was completely done with psychoanalysis and refused to use it. And by 55, he presented rational therapy. Um, he noticed that when his clients understood their irrational beliefs, they got better. So if he was able to help them to understand that their thinking was irrational, or their beliefs were irrational, then that insight helped them to get better. In 59, he founded the Institute for Rational Living, and that's where he was able to train therapists in this particular mode. In 62, he published Reason and Emotion in Psychotherapy. It's the theory of rational emotive therapy. At that time, that's what it was called. He didn't add the behavior, until the mid 90s. So it was RET for a long time. So you might see articles that say RET instead of REBT, which is what it's been since the 1990s. Then he passed away in 2007. He published over 50 books, 12,000 articles, papers, and essays. So he was definitely one of the more prolific people in terms of his writings. So, exploring his therapy a little bit more. What is rational emotive therapy or rational emotive behavior therapy? It focuses on identifying and challenging irrational beliefs that cause emotional distress and unproductive behavior. The goal of this therapy is to help individuals develop healthier, more rational ways of thinking and behaving. It's highly directive therapy. He's spending a lot of time talking and persuading. And if you remember some of those models back from week 2, where I showed, how much should a therapist talk or how much should a case manager talk, you'll see with rational emotive therapy, it's like 50-50 or 60-40 in terms of the therapist is talking more. So it's a highly directive, very spending a lot of time trying to persuade clients about their irrational beliefs. It can be even a little bit confrontational, and there's a lot of teaching, or what we might call psychoeducation, being emphasized in it. And it's not until the 90s that he adds the behavior to RET. One of the things that you may have seen or come across in some of your psychology classes is the musts or the shoulds. And so he talks about understanding irrational beliefs and their consequences. And so he has 3 basic musts. I must do well and win approval of all others, or else I'm no good. So if he's talking with a a client, he's going to be looking to see which one of these they do more when they're talking. And he says, if you are somebody who has some version of I must do well and win approval of all others, or else I'm no good. He says the emotional consequences are going to be depression, anxiety, or panic, and the behavioral consequences that you may be risk avoidant, you might be shy, you might procrastinate, you could be unassertive, or even engage in becoming a workaholic. So he said that there are consequences if we think in this way. Another must that some clients have, and he says that most clients have that he sees have a dominant must. Other people must do the right thing, otherwise they are no good and deserve to be punished. And so people who have this framework, the emotional consequences are anger, rage, fury, impatience, bitterness, and resentment. And the consequences, the behavioral consequences, is that they be aggressive or violent, bigotry or intolerance, bullying or nagging. So if people are like, others must do the right thing, otherwise they are no good and deserve to be punished. So do you project on other people? Or as in the first one, you're internalizing it as well. And then there's another one, which is life must be easy without discomfort or inconvenience. And if that is our must, then the emotional consequences we could have low frustration tolerance, we could have self-pity, we could also be prone to depression and anxiety. And the behavioral consequences are procrastination, shirking duties, addiction. So he saw a lot of people who had the life must be easy without discomfort or inconvenience struggle with addiction, or overindulgence in feel-good behaviors. Um, so those are his three basic musts, and when he's talking with clients, he's often trying to figure out which framework they are in. You also may have heard of the ABC model with cognitive therapy before, and that comes from Albert Ellis. So we're gonna work through what the ABC model is first. So the ABC model explains how irrational beliefs influence emotions. So this would be like a teaching moment that he would have with one of his clients. And so he would say the A stands for the activating event, the B stands for your belief about the event, and the C is the consequence of your belief. So activating event, something happens, B, person's belief about the event, C, person has an emotional reaction to the belief. And an example, a colleague disagrees with your idea in a team meeting. You believe because they disagree with you. So the activating event is that a colleague disagrees with your idea. Your belief about that disagreement is that I'm so stupid, I should have never said that. And the consequence of that thought is that you feel depressed or maybe even inadequate in some way. But then here's another version of it, how it could be interpreted. A colleague disagrees with your idea in a meeting, and another person might interpret it as, how dare they try to embarrass me like that? They better watch out. And the consequence of that thought is you feel angry. So often he'll even say you could have how people can experience the same event, but have a different interpretation, a different belief of that. So that's the ABC model. This is the homework. So you teach this in session and then you assign it as homework, a thought record, a thought journal, a worksheet, type of thing. Now, once they get good at identifying, activating events, beliefs, and consequences, so after a session or two where they get comfortable with it, then you teach them the disputing irrational belief. So that's when the ABC model turns into the ABCDE model. And so the D stands for disputing the belief and replacing it with effective beliefs. So here's an example. A colleague disagrees with your idea in a team meeting. You believe, I'm so stupid, I should have never said that. You feel depressed. Now, the you're going to be taught, the therapist is going to teach you how to dispute that. So the therapist will say, ask a question, is it realistic that people will agree all of the time? Have you ever disagreed with someone and not thought they were stupid? Are there benefits to disagreement? So these are the types of questions that a therapist would ask to help them think a different way about their thoughts, about their beliefs. And then once you kind of get them to move forward on that, then you would replace the that belief, the I'm so stupid belief, with something more effective. And that could be something like disagreements happen sometimes, and it does not reflect my intelligence. So those are some of the ways, and the disputing and the replacing, that's more of an advanced homework type of homework. Also interesting enough, Ellis noticed that therapists often have their own irrational beliefs that can interfere with effective practice. So I thought that was interesting and just wanted to share it with you. That so you could see, if you work with clients, if you've had any of these beliefs, or when you work with clients, if you have any of these beliefs. So number one is I have to be successful with all of my clients practically all of the time. That's a nice goal, but at the end of the day, that is not necessarily how working with people happens. Number two, I must be an outstanding therapist, clearly better than other therapists I know or hear about. Um, I have to be greatly respected and loved by all of my clients, or since I am doing my best and working so hard as a therapist, my clients absolutely should be equally hardworking and responsible, should listen to me carefully, and should push themselves to change. So these are the irrational beliefs that he finds that interfere with effective practice. So that's something to just look at and see if any of those sound familiar. All right, so moving towards Aaron Beck. So Aaron Beck also moved away from psychoanalysis and started developing his own cognitive therapy, which he just called cognitive therapy in the beginning. But Aaron Beck is a local boy done good. He was born in Providence, Rhode Island, and he lived on the East Side. He graduated from Hope High School in Providence. He went to Brown, got a BA in English and poli sci, and then went to med school. So he went over to Yale for med school. When he was in medical school, during his residency, there was a shortage of psychiatrists. So he switched from neurology, which he was studying, to psychology. He was persuaded to switch to psychiatry. He was trained in ego psychology, which is the psychoanalytic approach. Um, in 52, he became a professor at UPenn's University of Pennsylvania Psychiatry Department. And in the 60s, after practicing for a while, he became dissatisfied with psychoanalytic therapy and wanted to create an evidence-based therapy for depression. And that was his primary motivation when he was creating cognitive therapy. It was for depression originally. And because he was not someone who liked to be confrontational, and since the psychoanalytic societies did not like these cognitive or rational emotive therapies, he initially called his new therapy just neo-Freudian rather than using the word cognitive. In 75, he did end up publishing Cognitive Therapy and Emotional Disorders. In 94, he founded the Beck Institute in Pennsylvania, and that offers clinical services and provides training in CBT. And he passed away in 2021, and his daughter runs the Beck Institute in Pennsylvania. Throughout his career, he published 25 books and over 600 scientific articles, so he was also very prolific in the field. And getting into his cognitive therapy, how he developed his, and you'll see there's some similarities and some differences between um, Ellis and Beck. So his approach is very structured, it's short term, it's goal oriented, it focuses on changing distorted thinking patterns and negative beliefs. And eventually he added in unhelpful behaviors, but again, started mainly with the thinking patterns and negative beliefs that contribute to emotional distress and psychological problems. Some of the things that he did a little differently than Ellis, he was more collaborative. So if you ever watch any of the sessions, there are sessions of Beck and Ellis working with different patients, and you'll see Ellis is a little more confrontational, a little more active, and Beck's personality, if we look at use of self, he's more gentle, he's more collaborative, he's more soft-spoken. He was very focused on an empirical research, and he was very interested in using Socratic questionings or using open-ended questionings to encourage client reflection. So, using Socratic questioning was part of it, one of his techniques. And then in terms of how Beck's cognitive therapy evolved in the 60s, it was focused on cognitive thoughts. In the 70s, it started looking at behavioral strategies, and it wasn't until the 80s that he changed the name from cognitive therapy to cognitive behavioral therapy. So some of the important concepts or vocabulary or terms that are used in Beck's cognitive therapies are words like cognitive distortions, automatic negative thoughts, cognitive triangle, cognitive restructuring, schemas, and cognitive triad. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those. So cognitive distortions are the same thing as Ellis's irrational beliefs and very similar to Adler's basic mistake private logic. It's a pattern of negative thoughts or beliefs that can contribute to depression or anxiety and impact how a person perceives reality. So that's what he calls a cognitive distortion. That's what he's listening for when he's working with his clients, these negative thoughts or beliefs that are contributing to the depression or anxiety. He talks about automatic negative thoughts, and those are done unconsciously. They occur outside of conscious awareness, and they are very negative or self-critical. Um, and he also develops this term cognitive triangle, and that is that connection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. To replace the cognitive distortions, you use he uses the term cognitive restructuring, and that's the process of how you change the negative thoughts. So in Ellis's, it was the ABCDE model. So the D and the E was how you would do the cognitive restructuring, but he would call it like, disputing and um, disputing the thoughts. So, but Beck calls it cognitive restructuring. He also talks about schemas, and these are the core beliefs or assumptions that influence perceptions or interpretation of experience. Is somebody an optimist or a pessimist? That's usually inherent in who we are, and that idea is very similar to Adler's style of living. And then he also is listening for what he calls the cognitive triad, which is different than the cognitive triangle. So the cognitive triad are kind of like these beliefs about the self, the world, and the future, and they reinforce or maintain a person's depressive thinking. So first, there's a negative view of the self, where just you believe like I'm the worst or I'm a failure. And then so that's the belief about the self. And then there's a pessimistic belief about the world. So in this instant, if for a person who's like trying to get a job, the job market's stacked against me. There's no point in even trying. And then a hopeless view of the future. I will never have a successful career. So and these things, if you have a negative view of the self, the world, and the future, that will reinforce the depressive thinking. So that's also something that he's looking for with his clients. When we talk about cognitive distortions, a pattern of negative thinking, that impacts one's perceptions of the world. And so these are the different types of cognitive distortions that he noticed with his clients. So some clients might have one or two that tend to be the main ones that they go to. So they have fun names like arbitrary inferences. That's just a fancy way of saying jumping to conclusions. So an example could be mind reading. So belief that others are thinking badly about them without any evidence, fortune teller, imagining something bad happening in the future and then acting as if it were true. He's also got another cognitive distortion called selective abstractions, where a person focuses only on the negative. So imagine and I also noticed that selective abstractions are more likely to occur with a person who has depression versus anxiety. So that can even help with if you're having a difficulty trying to understand the diagnosis. If someone has this selective abstraction, that's more of a symptom of depression than anxiety. And so an example of that would be, out of 100 book ratings, the author focused on the three bad reviews. So just focusing on the worst. Overgeneralization. Is a belief that if you experience failure in one area one time, you will always fail. And so, if because I felt anxious at the conference, I will never be good at networking. Magnification and minimization, it's about evaluation. And so someone might magnify the negative. So if I get an A minus, of course that improves how inadequate I am. Or if they get an A, or all A's, they're just like, that doesn't mean I'm smart. So magnification or minimization can happen there. There's also personalization, interpreting others' behavior as being about oneself when it's not. Example, my coworker interrupted me because they think I am an embarrassment to the company. And that coworker may have interrupted them for many reasons, not necessarily what they are interpreting it about. Then there's labeling and mislabeling. It's a pattern a client uses to describe themselves or others in a negative way. Example, I'm such a loser, or they're the worst. And then dichotomous thinking. Also, you might have heard it as all or nothing, black or white, just thinking in terms of good or bad. And so, when you notice somebody who has this dichotomous thinking, you work on replacement language. Like, rather than saying I'm the best or I'm the worst, you want to focus on something more balanced. Like, sometimes I'm more effective and sometimes I'm less effective as a parent, teacher, therapist, spouse, partner, student, whatever it is. Sometimes I'm more effective, sometimes I'm less effective. Not I'm the best or the worst, but something that's a little more balanced. Automatic negative thoughts are sometimes referred to as ants. These are often spontaneous. They're outside of our conscious awareness, and they become a problem when when they keep a mood around. So that an emotion turns into a mood. So when we look at the cognitive triangle, that's the connection between the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, as I mentioned before. Thoughts could be, I'm not smart enough. Feelings, oh, well, that causes anxiety and stress. Behavior could make you procrastinate or avoid studying. The consequences of that behavior can lead you to do poorly on the test, which just reinforce uh, forces your original thought. See, I told you I'm not smart, right? So this is that these automatic negative thoughts and the spiral that we can get into in terms of how everything gets reinforced. He also liked to use Socratic questioning in CBT. So there's a lot of disciplines that like to use Socratic questioning. Philosophy like to use it. That's why it was developed by Socrates. Teachers like to use it. Law school likes to use it. Business leadership like to use this as a way. When you're using it in psychology, it is a much more gentle approach than maybe how it might be used in law school or even how Socrates used it. So you were infusing the Socratic method or Socratic questioning with a more person-centered way to help them challenge unhelpful thoughts and beliefs. So some of the Socratic questions that are used in CBT, they could be clarification. So what do you mean when you say, or challenging assumptions? Are there any other possible explanation, or asking them to elicit evidence to help them better understand the logic behind the belief? What evidence supports what you're saying? Or can you provide an example that supports what you're saying? There's also an alternative explanation to help the client expand their perspective. Are there alternative ways to look at this situation? What might be another explanation or point of view? There's the impact of automatic thoughts, like examining potential consequences. What could happen if you continue to think this way? How could your belief affect you in the long term? So thinking about the long-term consequences of this, evaluating consequences. How would you benefit by changing this belief, or what would it mean if you gave up that belief? And then distancing questions. If this happened to a friend, would you have the same thoughts about them? So those are some of the Socratic questionings to help a client um, understand their cognitive distortions, and then work towards replacing them with something that's more balanced, doing the cognitive restructuring. So coming to the end of CBT, so the takeaways are there's that connection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And if we can change how we think, then we can change how we feel and act. CBT is focused on identifying and challenging our negative thoughts, especially the negative thoughts that cause depression, that cause anxiety. It teaches practical coping skills that can be used in everyday life, which we didn't really focus on in uh, with this, but it also does teach coping skills. CBT is structured, goal-oriented, and short-term. The average sessions can be anywhere between like 12 and 16 to help somebody with depression. And remember, that's much more effective or efficient than psychoanalysis, which is like 5 to 7 years or something along those lines. And it's widely used. It's the gold standard for treating depression and anxiety. It's also used to treat PTSD and OCD. It's not the only therapies that treat PTSD and OCD, because we talked about EMDR for PTSD, but PTSD is probably one of the most difficult things to treat. So with PTSD, you have to see what works with the client. And for some clients, CBT will work for PTSD, but for a lot of people, it will not, and it will need to try something else. Um, and CBT is meant to be empowering. It's meant to be an empowering type of therapy, helping people to recognize unhelpful thinking patterns and replacing them with healthier ones. Your final paper, paper three, isn't really so much a paper as it is doing CBT homework. So looking at your thoughts, the connection between your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors, and then working on replacing them. So you're gonna, uh, a recommendation is like, and when you look at the assignment, you'll see that it's, you're not doing therapy on yourself, just like everyday things. Like, so, if you wake up in the morning and you hate getting up in the morning, it could simply be like, well, what thoughts are contributing to like the negative thinking that you have about waking up, and seeing if you can work with them, or, procrastinating doing your homework, or procrastinating doing your chores, or being stuck in traffic. So those kind of like everyday mundane things, but getting 3 or 5 of those examples in your life where you notice your automatic thoughts, and then learning to challenge them. And then you'll write a reflection on that, and that'll be your final paper. And hopefully that will help you understand CBT a little bit more by applying it to yourself, rather than doing the type of papers that you have been doing in this class. So we'll end here, and we'll come back for the final chapter, which is going to be on family systems. So we will come back and do that for the last week of the course. All right. Take care. Bye.